Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
The book's genesis really is a reflection that has kind of been on my mind for as many years as I've been involved with these campaigns and efforts to try and create more of an alignment between meeting human needs and what the planet can actually provide. And this background narrative, which has been there all the time and which has come back with a vengeance in the last few years, which goes along the lines of suggesting that there is somehow a choice between looking after nature on the one hand and growing the economy and meeting human needs on the other. And you can see this all the time. It was there at Rio+20 with the standoff between countries over the apparent choice between development and poverty reduction and looking after systems like forests and the oceans. And you hear it from time to time closer to home. And in fact, we've heard it quite a lot since the 2010 general election, with senior politicians suggesting in policy statements that there is somehow a drag on the process of economic recovery being caused by environmental rules. That's why I wrote the book, really, was to bring to hopefully wider attention the fact that there is now a massive body of insight, knowledge, data, and information and science out there which proves the opposite to be the case, and that in fact economic development into the future is going to be impossible unless we conserve the natural systems which support the processes which lead to improved human welfare. We've had a great controversy in this country in recent times over the amount of money being spent on solar panels, for example, through the feed-in tariff. How much attention have we paid to soils in helping to mitigate the effects of climate change? Almost none, of course, is the answer. And so this is really one of the ways in which I begin to unpack a narrative which is about relating different aspects of natural systems and how they're sustaining our economic welfare, and to point out how billions of pounds are being spent on research into carbon capture and storage when we've got natural systems doing this for nothing if we manage them in the right way. And that same natural system, in this case soils, of course, is delivering a whole load of other benefits in terms of replenishment and the purification of fresh water, recharging aquifers. And of course, in those soils, there are numberless microorganisms doing the job of recycling of nutrients, amongst other things. And the job of recycling nutrients over billions of years by microorganisms in soils has led them to develop all sorts of survival solutions, which we're beginning to discover are actually quite important in the human world. And so there's a group of microorganisms called actinobacteria that dwell in soils. These are the sources for all of our modern antibiotics, the most ones in widespread use at least. And the biodiversity that's in the soils, of course, is only one aspect. And we're beginning to find that the biodiversity in the oceans and on land has huge economic benefits for humankind. We know, obviously, that all of our food production is based upon once wild biodiversity. We know that much of the world's pharmaceutical industry is similarly founded on solutions discovered by animals and plants through the process of natural selection. And we're beginning to understand now how there is huge value in looking at nature as an inspiration for design and engineering, the so-called discipline of biomimicry. Everything from car design to paints, to coatings for buildings, to heat and energy efficiency for design, being discovered from things like termites, butterflies, and fish, just because of the way in which they've evolved their solutions to their own particular problems. We tend to still see nature as things, as resources. So the resource that we can get from taking an antibiotic design from a microorganism, or from the food we get from land and the benefits we get from water. There's a whole other layer, however, of this, and it's about the relationships that exist between living things and how they provide benefits to humankind as well. One of the stories that I think is most powerful in the book, which kind of communicates this pretty well, is the story of the demise of India's vultures. So in the early 1990s, there were something like 40 million of these birds, 3 species living across the Indian subcontinent. Today, there's just a few tens of thousands left. So these birds have virtually gone extinct. The reason that happened was because of the use of a drug in veterinary medicine called Diclofenac. What people didn't realize as they were injecting this stuff into cattle was that if there was a residue that finished up in the body of a dead cow or buffalo, it was lethal to vultures. And so one dead cow would attract perhaps several hundred vultures in a feeding event. All of those birds would die. In a very short time, the population was literally wiped out. So the economic consequences of this were several. For one thing, Very poor people were deprived of their livelihood, which was previously based upon gathering leather and bones to make fertilizer from dead animals. But the public health side of this was more important by a long way, because the vultures, between them, were eating about 12 million tons of putrefying meat per year in the countryside, meat that was then available to other animals. The principal beneficiary of the demise of the vultures turned out to be India's wild dog population. It rocketed by 7 million animals over the period of very few years, because there was so much more for them to eat. This led to more dog bites. That led to more rabies infections, and the researchers who looked into this in some detail estimate 50,000 additional human deaths to have occurred as a result of the vulture's demise, costing the Indian economy something like $34 billion. And I came across another very good example of how this works in nature through the outbreak of West Nile virus in the United States in 2002. It killed a couple of thousand people, cost a couple of $100 million to the US economy. But what became apparent after this outbreak was how the distribution of this disease was quite patchy. And researchers looking into the places where people were infected compared to where they weren't discovered how there was a negative correlation between infections and bird biodiversity. So where there were more birds, less people caught West Nile virus. And the reason for this is because the vector of West Nile virus is a mosquito, and it prefers to bite birds if it can, but will bite people when it can't find enough to eat. On the subject of pest control as well, we've become quite used to measuring the economic benefit of selling chemicals into the market. There's a new body of evidence emerging out there about the extent to which, for example, insectivorous birds are helping to control pests in ways which are economically beneficial in agriculture. One beautiful study I discovered by a couple of Dutch researchers looking at the effects of great tits in an apple orchard discovered that where the great tits were breeding and therefore catching lots of caterpillars to feed their chicks, the apple harvest was 50% bigger than in those places where the tits weren't present, where they were excluded experimentally. So putting up nest boxes could be a very good way of avoiding chemical use. And irrespective of what you think about chemicals, they're expensive. And a blue tit nest box or great tit nest box seems like a very good alternative if you believe that kind of research. And then there's the water cycle, something that's getting more on the agenda in recent times, not least because of water scarcity in some parts of the world, but also flooding. And again, delving into this, one realizes that water is something more than simply a commodity that comes out of a tap and which is being provided by utilities that are building concrete reservoirs and pipe networks. And one of the things that probably we underestimate in terms of looking at the economics of water is the role being played by oceanic plankton, particularly coccolithophores, tiny little plants drifting in the surface of the ocean, which produce a substance called dimethyl sulfide, which when it gets into the atmosphere combines with oxygen to create sulfate particles around which the vapor coming off the sea coalesces to form clouds. A large part of the cloud being formed on Earth each day is down to these plankton. And of course, the clouds is the way in which fresh water gets redistributed around the planet, and of course then restocking reservoirs and falling onto agricultural land. And the reason why we might be concerned about that particular ecosystem service is the progressive acidification of the oceans that's going alongside the carbon dioxide pollution of the atmosphere and causing the shell-forming animals in the oceans to have challenges with their metabolism. And these things are calcite-forming organisms. They're tiny, but they form shells, and the extent to which they can continue to do that with a rapidly acidifying ocean is something that we should be paying close attention to. And of course, when the rain hits the land, what does it do? It doesn't flow straight into reservoirs. It gets captured by different ecosystems and then released into the environment in different ways. One of the ecosystems I came across, which is hugely important in different parts of the world, and certainly in a way which has hitherto eluded most economists, is an ecosystem that covers a relatively small area, but which has a huge economic implication, and that's the so-called cloud forest ecosystems. So these occur on mountains, generally at about a couple of thousand meters at altitude. These particular bodies of vegetation intercept clouds and strip water out of the air, even though it's not raining. And they have a very deep leaf litter underneath the trees, maybe a meter deep. And this is like a gigantic sponge and soaks up water, enabling dry season river flow in areas where otherwise it's not raining, and you wouldn't have any river flow were it not for the cloud forests. But the concluding part of what I've written really is about the prevailing view in economics and why we're still failing to capture this set of unquestionably important economic services being provided to humankind, and describe what is, for me, a kind of conceptual kind of contradiction that occurs in economics. So who remembers Bernie Madoff being put away a couple of years ago for his Ponzi scheme? He got 150 years in jail for defrauding investors by convincing them that he was investing their money in productive financial instruments, when in fact what he was doing was getting more money and paying returns to people out of other people's investments. What he was doing is basically blowing the capital and counting it as a dividend, and he went to jail for that for a very long time. What we're doing with the Earth's ecosystems is a giant planet-scale Ponzi. We're liquidating the cloud forests, the soils, the aquifers, the pollinating insects, the insectivorous birds, the coastal wetlands that are defending property, and we're counting that as growth. I think that's a very strong parallel in the sense of how economists can have this myopic approach towards nature compared to the one they take towards finance. And with that kind of thinking, I'm kind of paying off the narrative by suggesting that we need a different approach to economics and find different ways in which we can bring these kinds of values into more visible elements of how the economy works. And there's all sorts of things out there that can do this. But the point is that the tools are available. It's the mindset that is lacking. So how would we describe the mindset that might be fit for the future in terms of how we're going to meet the needs of 9 billion people and do that through hanging on to nature's services? And the thing that I'm calling for in the book really is the emergence of a so-called bioeconomy. And the bioeconomy is really a fusion between the world of human economics and the world of the biosphere. Because the reality is that we're living in a sealed system. And if these two things are not brought into being one way of doing things, rather than being seen as trade-offs and alternatives, with action for one, i.e. the environment, being seen as damaging to the other, the economy, we're not going to get very far. So this is about a shift in the way in which we look at the world, and I don't think it's very complicated, actually. The thing that surprises me enormously is the fact that we haven't really got there yet, and that we're still having this conversation, seeing that choice which is there, which is an utterly false choice. And so hopefully we're at that time in history where we begin to see a tipping point and to see the world as it really is.
So you're coming from a very clear intention and knowledge, but the way life works is often the vested interests and the power structures co-opt a good idea and actually use it in a destructive way, and to say actually that if you put money on it, it will be the rich elites that will actually benefit from it. So what are the dangers of, yes, it's a great idea, yes, we need to do it, but actually life isn't, it's like unintended consequences in nature.
There are dangers of doing it, but there's bigger dangers in not doing it, if I put it like that. Because you just have a look at the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, or the recent IPCC work, or some of the studies looking at the state of tropical forests or the oceans. All of these trends are getting to the point where there are going to be some pretty unpleasant consequences, not for ecology, but for people. And so if we're going to be able to arrest those trends in time, I think we're going to have to engage with some things that, we may not be able to see the end point as we begin to unpack the arguments. But I don't think we're in that zone yet. We're still at the basic, square one of trying to convince people that that nature has an economic value. And actually, that's the other thing, Joe, I would say about this, is that I think it's really, really important to draw a distinction between valuing nature and then taking the tools to reflect that value into the economic policies and choices that countries are making. And at the moment, I don't think we've even got a consensus around the economic value. I think that's fair to say. And if you look at some of the Chancellor's speeches, and actually not just him, the opposition is saying nothing about this either. Politics is bereft of any sense of this. And so I think we've got a bit of a job to do to lift it up. And in my experience as a campaigner at Friends of the Earth for a very long time, one of the things that I found is that the political system tends to catch up with stuff that the public have got already. And so, I think this is about having a conversation in society and raising awareness about this, and then hopefully propelling it into the political domain quite soon after. But I don't think we're at the point yet where the dangers of, ecosystem services and offsetting are really there. And once we get to that point and we're debating those tools, I think that's the moment to really put the safeguards in place.
When I was at Rio, the idea of valuing natural capital was the one idea that actually seemed to have any vague consensus as a direction that lots of people could buy into.
Sure.
But again, the speed at which we need to move and the speed this is moving are sort of not in line. You talked about the need for a tipping point. Of course, we never know what the tipping point is. But when you look ahead for the next 5 to 10 years, what is it that's going to ignite this to sort of really, wrong metaphor probably, but to really make this come really into the mainstream, not just in terms of the thinking, but in terms of the acting?
So I think it's going to be a combination of different groups in society who have influence beginning to talk about this in a way where it looks like it's real. And so economists, how many economists in mainstream academic institutions or in treasuries and finance ministries are talking about this in the way that the ecosystem services scientists are talking about it? It's not very many, but it's growing, and I think that would be one thing that would turn us into a political tipping point, if you will. Another force which is running in parallel to that, and actually is a little bit ahead of the mainstream economists, it seems to me, is some of the private sector companies who've put two and two together. And so unlike some democratic governments, some of the companies, they're 120 years old and they're thinking a little bit about, 3-4 decades out rather than the next 3 months. And as a result, you see the likes of Unilever and Nestle and Skanska and Danone and a few other quite major corporations beginning to build natural capital into how they're planning their businesses. They're still in the minority, but I think one of the things that's going to become apparent quite soon is that those companies are actually doing better than those who aren't, because they're managing risk better. They've got a better understanding of their supply chains and their markets, and as a result of that, they're going to start to grow their markets at the expense of those who haven't got it. That's going to be another tipping point. Another one, I think, will be the NGOs getting on top of this, and I think they're a bit behind the curve, actually, with a few exceptions, and still a little bit confused about what they think about this. And this goes back to my point around the extent to which this, the valuation and the tools to reflect the valuation are two distinct bits of the discourse. This is about the first bit, really, about the valuation piece. And so if the NGOs catch up a little bit, I think that would be helpful too. And then, of course, there's the vast body of academic and intellectual effort going into this, making the case and gathering data. And those four streams are kind of running together. And I am optimistic about this. And as you said, Joe, at Rio, the natural capital discourse and the piece about measurement, it has now got legs on it. And I think, building that momentum, but crucially getting it into the political discussion is going to be really quite crucial.